You're listening to the Interconnect Hub podcast, powered by DataGrid. DataGrid is a premier data center provider located in the iconic 60 Hudson Street building. To learn more, visit www.datagryd.com. Enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Interconnect Hub. This is Doug Foresta. Today with me, of course, is Tom Brown, the president and CEO of DataGrid. Also joining us is Rhonda Binda. Rhonda is the co-founder and COO for Venture Smarter and executive director of the Smart Regions Initiative. Rhonda, Tom, welcome.
Thank you, Doug. Rhonda, thanks very much for joining the episode of Interconnect Hub. Appreciate having you today. If you could, for our listeners, if you can just kindly give a background. I'm really stoked about your background and what you bring to the table and how it fits into the DataGrid model. But for our listeners, if you can just give a background, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Doug and Tom. It really is such an honor to be here with you today and to have a conversation about the intersection of what you're doing and the growth of smart cities. And so people want to know, what really constitutes a smart city and how can they build towards that dream of becoming a connected community. And what we've been doing over the past few years is really taking a step back and looking at what are those foundational elements that every community would need to become a smart and connected community. And in that work, we've come up with a framework around what we call CMR, the Connectivity, Mobility, Resiliency Methodology. And the first part of that is really having the connectivity of electricity, of broadband, of making sure that we are able to have that foundational layer to then build on top and leverage other technologies. The second component is around mobility, and that's making sure you can move people to and from where they need to go in and around a city and a community, and increasing especially those public transportation options. And of course, the last pillar is around resiliency and making sure that all of these things are secure, they're safe, and there's an eye towards sustainability as we're moving forward and adopting new technologies. And so this is the framework that we've come up with. And to give you a little bit of background of what we've been doing, on Capitol Hill last year, we created a caucus with Congressman Issa and Congresswoman Clark and organized the 50-plus committees on Capitol Hill that had dealt with these issues around infrastructure and technology around the CMR methodology. They also are very concerned with future of work, so we added on a fourth pillar there for the briefings that we've now been having on a regular basis between technology companies and Capitol Hill to try to close that gap between policy and technology. And so as background, we've been working on really making this more manageable for cities all across the U.S. to move towards this dream of becoming, a city that is more responsive to their citizens because it's leveraging technology. It's becoming more efficient, saving our taxpayer dollars, again, by leveraging technology. And then what we're seeing now with AI is, anticipating the needs of citizens, and so that we can get ahead of the problems and just be even more responsive.
Ron, I really appreciate that, and that's a great background. I just had a couple of questions for you. So whenever I speak on a panel, whether it's locally here in New York or across the country, typically there's someone, a representative on a panel that's representing local government, and every initiative that we constantly talk about, which is very common, is smart cities. For our listeners, if you had to, and again, I'm a sports fan, so I'm going to put it towards a baseball game, where would you think we are in regards to the launch of smart cities? If it's a 9-inning baseball game, where would you think we are at this point?
I would say we're probably still, really just at the second or third inning here.
I agree.
And even in New York City, which is rated the number one in the world, once again, it's always usually between, London, obviously Singapore, Estonia is high on the list globally, and then you have cities like New York that are quite competitive. But really, there's so many gaps still if you look across the 5 boroughs. And so that's why I'm really excited about what you've been able to do, building the state-of-the-art center here in the heart of New York, because I do think that we have to think locally about how can we, with all the great technology that we're looking to leverage for the cities, how can we make sure that our records and our data can still be stored locally in the case of emergency and for security issues and just to have access. And so, we're moving more in that direction in terms of digitizing all of the city records. We're looking at becoming even more connected to be able to digitize services from, parking meters to lights to, fire trucks and emergency response efforts that are just there. It seems that we're getting safer and more connected, but we have to make sure that as we're looking to become safer and more digitized in terms of our local government services, that we are, we're secure, and that we have the right access to all this data. And so, I do think we have a ways to go, especially since we have new technology around 5G and so much more coming out with what we can do with IoT and artificial intelligence that can also be quite helpful in the public sector as well as in private sector. We're looking at governments starting to understand better how they can leverage, but I still do think we're at the very early stages.
And I agree with that. I couldn't agree with you more. We work very closely with firms like Zenfi Networks, which you're very familiar with, and Ray LaChance, the president, CEO, and founder of the company, agrees that we're still in the early stages, right? 5G today is a marketing term, but the opportunity is really limitless. And one of the things that we hang our hat on is that foundation that you just spoke about. And when you think about New York City and you think where we are against the rest of the world, you need these aggregation points, right? So with all of these different applications that you just mentioned, how are they processed and where are they stored, whether they're locally stored or then have to be stored on what we call a server farm or a data center farm that's in remote areas that's not critical, is all still under development. But we believe here at DataGrid, and that's why we have transitioned from more of a wholesale model, large multi-megawatt type of data center to smaller footprints. And we're about ready to do our ribbon cutting this week, December 4th. We're excited about to showcase, yes, there's more compute power, but smaller parcels of space. And it's really about that foundation. So when you think about it, there's 4 million oddballs that sit outside this on this very island of Manhattan on any given day. So how are we going to process that, right? And it's really all stems from that infrastructure. Not only do you have this great building called 60 Hudson Street that is a aggregation point of several hundred providers, but you're going to need that, and you use the word gaps. There's other gaps that need to be filled throughout the 5 boroughs that need to be addressed. So I couldn't agree with you more that we have an opportunity, but there still needs to be more aggregation points. There's 3,200 intersections here in the city of New York that all need to be lit up, and there'll be some sort of infrastructure on those intersections to fulfill those applications. But if you could you talk a little bit more about the Smart Infrastructure Challenge that you also announced as well?
Yeah, we were, looking around the country, and we saw so many great efforts happening that we wanted to somewhat learn and share best practices from what was happening in places in the West Coast, and the East Coast, and the Midwest. And so we teamed up with the Smart City Capital group out of Miami, Florida, and issued somewhat of a reverse RFP about a year and a half ago around an infrastructure challenge where we had 4 streams of the competition having to do with smart and safer streets and future of transportation, about building more connected communities and resiliency. And so we received actually, more applications than when the Department of Transportation had their infrastructure challenge in 2016. And we have our pulse now on what's happening all across the country just from that process itself. And we helped a lot of these competing groups get to a point where we're able to now match them with some of the partners that they need to move forward on their projects. And so one of the runner-ups is right here in New York, Silicon Harlem. And they have put together really a great effort through a public-private partnership. They're also looking at building out a data center in Upper Manhattan And it's been just really great because not only do we have a better sense of all of what's happening across the country, but we're able to share those best practices and also share the learnings and the private sector partners that may or may not have access to all of these localities. We're actually able to help better pair and match them as we see what the needs are from the locality. So it was a really great exercise. The great thing about working with the federal government has been not only the resources and certain expertise that they can lend, but it's just being able to really, as you say, connect vertically between the state, local, and federal. I think that as we're able to share those resources, that we're able to, really see a multiply effect on the benefits across regions and not just the cities. And so that's why we've moved towards calling from smart cities to smart regions, because really it's about getting to not just these hubs, which are great. It's awesome to be in New York City, but we really want to start thinking about how can we make sure that what's happening in Manhattan is really reaching the outer boroughs, is reaching Long Island, and reaching some of the suburbs and more rural areas as well.
So, Rhonda, are you suggesting that you're seeing smart cities being engineered from the inside out? And what I mean by that, there's also real estate portfolios that are now saying, hey, we need to make all of our buildings in the portfolio smart buildings, right? So you're identifying as a building, and then you might identify it as a particular neighborhood or neighborhoods or certain areas or townships, because on every agenda that I see in local government, in town government, all the way up through the city, state, and then federal government, you're seeing this initiative. Would you say that's an accurate statement for our listeners?
Yeah, I think it's very much that hub and spoke approach. So you start really, at the building level. And in fact, this year, there's a group that we work with out of Department of Commerce called GCTC, Global Cities Teams Connect. And please feel free to join and to look that up. It's about over 200 cities around the world connect on building standards around areas. So last year we focused on cybersecurity. This year we launched 2 new superclusters. One was around AI, and the second is around buildings. And what we're going to be doing is creating standards around what really makes a smart building. So, as I mentioned, we stepped back 2 years ago and focused on what are the pillars for a smart city. And now we're really looking more specifically at building by building, block by block, and putting out those parameters. And again, working with organizations like IEEE to create standards that we can work across the board for scalability and interoperability. So, this is exactly what we're focused on now, and then taking that hub and spoke approach. So starting it maybe in a more dense city area, but then how do we then use those learnings and then translate that as we move out to the suburbs and more rural areas?
Sure, and DataGrid would certainly love to participate in any ongoing standards, because here at 60 Hudson Street, we are the standard, particularly here for a smart city, of an aggregation point in creating that foundation for the ability to interconnect with hundreds of providers. Obviously, we know the challenge out in more remote areas, you're not going to have that density, but would certainly love to participate in any way that we could, Rhonda, that would talk about DataGrid's model and how we could replicate that.
Yeah, I love that there's, that because of work that you're doing, that New York continues to lead in this area and to set that example, because everyone comes here to see what we're doing and to learn from all of our success.
Well, great. Rhonda, this is really beneficial, and for our listeners, this is certainly a topic of interest that we want to share. And thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, and congratulations on your ribbon cutting. Really excited to see what you're doing.
Great, Rhonda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Interconnect Hub podcast powered by DataGrid. DataGrid is a premier data center provider located in the iconic 60 Hudson Street building. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you consume your audio. To learn more about DataGrid and the services they provide, visit www.datagryd.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back soon with a new episode.